Good evening and welcome. My name is Dr. Stacey Farraway and I'm the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Future Growth at La Trobe University. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the fact that tonight's event and our participants are located on the lands of traditional custodians throughout Australia, and I pay my respects to Indigenous elders past and present and extend this respect to Indigenous participants joining us online. Now, I'm delighted to welcome you to the second event in this year's Ideas in Society series, the 16th year that La Trobe University Emeritus Professor Robert Mann AO has presented the series. My role at La Trobe involves overseeing the university's global partnerships, including our research collaborations, offshore teaching, international student arrivals, and outbound exchange programs. So I'm particularly interested in the topic of tonight's discussion, the future of Australia's alliance with the United States. But the status of our alliance certainly isn't something that only affects Australia's international education sector, or for that matter, any one industry or endeavour. It is being felt in every corner of the economy, from agriculture and manufacturing to finance and digital technology. It is affecting researchers at our universities, with funding and collaborations being called into question. And, as we heard at the first Ideas in Society event in March with Tim Flannery, it is affecting climate science and efforts to keep global temperatures below the limit of 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, agreed in Paris in 2015. And it's having a chilling existential impact that extends far beyond share market indices, national trade accounts, and economic growth indicators. Decades-old institutions and practices governing democracy, security, and geopolitics are being dismantled. So, what does this mean for Australia's defence and intelligence alliance with the United States? What does it mean for the AUKUS, about which we are already accustomed to seeing headlines about whether and when it will fulfil its promise of delivering Australia advanced submarine capabilities, and at what cost? And what about the other forces at play in our region, especially China's rise as a global economic and military power, and the apparent almost complete deterioration of diplomatic relations between China and the United States? Moreover, while AUKUS is a trilateral agreement, perhaps we need to consider the policy dynamic not just between Washington, London, and Canberra, but also Beijing. These and many other questions are becoming more pressing by the day. And we are fortunate to have an outstanding panel with us today to consider what's at stake and how Australia should respond. And it's my pleasure to introduce them now. We have Professor the Honourable Gareth Evans, AC, who's a Distinguished Honorary Professor at the Australian National University, where he was Chancellor from 2010 to 2019. He was a Cabinet Minister in the Hawke and Keating Labor governments, including serving as Australia's Minister for Foreign Affairs from 1988 to 1996. Emeritus Professor Hugh White, AO, who has worked on Australian defence and foreign policy issues since 1980. He was the principal author of Australia's Defence White Paper, published in 2000. His books include How to Defend Australia, which was published by the La Trobe University Press in 2019. Professor Jennifer Parker is an expert associate at the Australian National University National Security College. She served in the Royal Australian Navy for more than 20 years, including extensive operational experience. She has undertaken naval appointments in areas including force design strategy and international exercise planning and operations. And finally, our moderator, Professor Nick Bisley, Dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences and Professor of International Relations at La Trobe University. He is a Fellow of the Australian Institute for International Affairs and an expert on Asia's international relations, great power politics, and the Australian foreign and defence policy. So I'll now hand over to Nick to get tonight's discussion underway. Thank you.
Thank you, Stacey. And I'd like to add my welcome to everyone this evening and also pay my respects to traditional owners of the lands on which we are all gathered. I'm here in Bundoora on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to any traditional owners any First Nations people joining us this evening. Just to begin, to let you know that we have opted not to run an interactive Q&A system in this evening's discussion. When participants registered, they were able to put forward questions or areas and topics they'd like us to cover. We have over 1,200 people sign up, and so we had literally hundreds and hundreds of suggestions of questions and topics. And so we've integrated those into the discussion structure that I've organised for the panelists this evening. So I think we're going to cover a good deal of terrain, and it will allow our panelists an opportunity to get in a little bit more detail into those topics. So to begin, it's been a pretty wild first 100 or so days. International relations scholars are a pretty hard-bitten lot, fairly jaded, fairly cynical. We think we've seen it all. And since January 20th, you can choose your euphemism, whether it's been bewildering, whether it's been consequential. It's been pretty astounding, even for the most, I think, hard-edged of us, whether it's the shocking treatment of President Zelensky in the White House, in which the democratically elected president of a country that had been invaded by an authoritarian neighbor was publicly humiliated, his support withdrawn by the country that had hitherto been its staunchest supporter and friend, whether it was J.D. Vance appearing at the Munich Security Conference, waggling his finger at the Europeans, leading to senior and very serious officials in Europe from allied countries, NATO members, saying that Washington was not just no longer a reliable partner, but had become, quote, an enemy. Serious people are talking about whether we may in fact be in the end of days for NATO, the longest lived, most expansive and most important military alliance, certainly of our lifetimes, if not in modern history. And then there was the tariff chaos launched on the 2nd of April, in which the United States entered into probably one of the greatest acts of self-harm in trade policy history, in which it announced an extensive and quite astonishing array of tariffs, taking the United States back to the pre-Depression era tariff levels, in fact, higher than those that existed prior to the 1929 crash. And we have in the American government a presidency or an administration that is organized very much around the one man of Donald Trump. That is, in the words of The Economist, akin to the court of an aging and mercurial king. But we shouldn't be too surprised about Trump, at least in the sense that there have been signs of sclerosis in the American political system for decades. Populism has been around, and a kind of pretty crude, nationalistic, at times openly racist nationalism has been around for a decade. And most consequentially, I think, from a foreign policy point of view, the domestic support for the kind of liberal internationalism that has defined much of American foreign policy in the post-45 period has been in very open question for a considerable period of time. And Australia has spent the better part of 25 years tying itself ever more closely to the United States, from the invocation of the ANZUS Treaty after the September 11th terrorist attacks by Prime Minister John Howard, through until the announcement of the AUKUS agreement and on to today. It feels almost a year doesn't go by in which there's a new announcement of a way in which Australia and the United States have become more interoperable, more interconnected in terms of foreign and defence policy. And this is a country which I think hitherto we felt as if there was a strong degree of shared political culture, shared values, shared democratic norms, and a shared commitment to a kind of overarching international order. None of us can take that for granted any longer, particularly in the light of the election that's just occurred in Australia. And think back to the tariff announcements on the 2nd of April, which Prime Minister Albanese said in perhaps the most benign way you could possibly characterize it, which was, this was not the act of a friend. So what does this mean for us, and what does this mean for the alliance? What I'm going to do is set an open question for each of our three panelists to have a sort of immediate go at this and to lay out a bit of a stall, and then we'll work our way through these issues. I'll start with you, Gareth. What do you think is the most immediate challenge that Australia faces from the Trump administration, given both the fact we have an alliance and a formal treaty, and then the considerable political investment that both sides of politics have laid down over a long period of time in that relationship?
Well, thanks very much, Nick, and a great pleasure to join you all. Well, having in the White House the most unprincipled, unpredictable, and unintelligent occupant in historical memory certainly poses challenges for us, both in security and economic terms, along with many other countries, of course. I think in security terms, the crucial challenge is to keep what's best in the alliance relationship, the intelligence support, the logistics support with high-tech capabilities otherwise probably unobtainable, while at the same time avoiding the worst, being sucked further into the embrace of a highly unstable, highly unpredictable, and highly unprincipled partner who more obviously now than ever before, it's always been the case, but more obviously now, we can't assume will be there for us if we ever ourselves run into serious security risk strife. For Trump, far more obviously than any of his predecessors, alliances are encumbrances rather than assets. So the more insurance we think we're buying, not only by keeping intact the long-standing Pine Gap arrangement, which has its own issues, but the more we think we're buying insurance by building submarine bases in Stirling, by building B-52 bases in Tyndall, marine bases in Darwin, the more risk we're posing for ourselves that we will be drawn into a conflict not of our own making, not of our own choosing, and certainly not in our own national interests. AUKUS is Exhibit A, I think, in this respect, and no doubt we'll come back to this in a lot more detail. But the basic bottom line, I think, here is the eye-watering amounts we are spending on this capability to build a capability that we're building a capability to meet threats that are most likely to arise simply because we're building that capability and making it available to our partner, our highly erratic partner. So that's on the security side. I don't want to overstate the immediate dimension of the security risk to us. I think there's been a bit of a red alert tendency in sections of the media and sections of the commentariat and certainly sections of the defence and intelligence agencies to wildly overstate that threat. I don't think it's something that is immediately on the horizon in the next period of the Trump administration. But it does mean, I think, that security anxiety that is now accentuated by Trump's arrival, it does mean that we have to focus quite a lot harder on a broader strategy for dealing with this, which I summarise, and we'll no doubt come back to this, is less America, more self-reliance, more Asia, and more global engagement. In economic terms, much more briefly, I think the risks of Trump, again, with all his wild unpredictability and unprincipled character and general indefensibility, the risks are twofold. I mean, the first flow directly from the security risks I've already described. Should the place go pear-shaped and we get sucked into any kind of a serious conflict with China, well, the economic implications of that, now resource trade, of course, would be absolutely obviously catastrophic. But much more immediately, the economic risk flows from the quite lunatic Trump tariff policy that's now being pursued in an atmosphere of great uncertainty and unpredictability, and we'll no doubt come back to this. In the first instance on Australia directly, although not as acutely for us as for many other countries because of the relatively low level of the reciprocal tariff, so-called, that's being imposed, 10%, much more obviously and much more potentially seriously, the economic risk for us flows from a major slowdown of the Chinese economy associated with the tariff war with China, and that could really, really hurt us. It will depend on how quick China is to, if the whole tariff thing proceeds as it's currently trajectory to do. A lot will depend on the extent to which China can quickly develop its domestic consumption capability or find alternative markets. But we have to assume that there'll be a significant slowing down impact that's already been identified by the economists internationally, and we'll be certainly disbeneficiaries of that. Beyond the security and economic challenges, there are obvious challenges, which we can just mention in a sentence, challenges to the whole global institutional order, the United Nations, the WHO, the World Trade Organization, the International Criminal Court, and God knows what else, under real assault from Trump. And there's issues there from which Australia will be a disbeneficiary along with many other countries, most of the rest of the world. There are the challenges posed, secondly, by the sheer indecency of so much of the Trump policy positioning, in particular the complete walking away from any kind of sense of responsibility for supplying aid to the world's poorer countries. And that creates real humanitarian stresses all over the world, which, that will have implications for us as for any other country which prides itself on any kind of decency to pick up these pieces. And then, of course, there's the walking away by Trump from any serious attempt to address the most serious existential risks of all to life on this planet as we know it, climate and pandemics. I'm a little more confident that he's got his head in a semi-correct place when it comes to the other great existential risk we have with nuclear weapons. He does seem to have a Reaganite distaste for nuclear weapons and does seem to be potentially capable of getting some arms control negotiations with Russia back on track in that respect. But on every other front, we're looking at a train wreck in the White House, and that certainly poses some challenges for us, which we have lots to talk about and how we meet them.
And like Reagan, he seems to want to erect a missile defense shield with references to a golden dome, which looks like it has a pretty substantial check that will need to be written to make it good on that. But we'll come back to a lot of those issues. That's fantastic, Gareth. So, Jennifer, your crack at what you think are the most immediate challenges that Australia faces from the Trump administration.
Well, thanks, Nick. Thanks for having me on, and great to see everyone online. I can't see you all online, but I appreciate you being online. Look, I think, to be honest, the biggest challenge for us is actually the way we deal with it. I think, that old adage, control what you can control, is really important. I think Australia needs to play things as we see them and just avoid over dramatizing things. And, I mean, no disrespect, Gareth, but I don't agree with President Trump's decisions on a lot of things, right? Being female doesn't make you a bad helicopter pilot, for example. But we do need to remember that he is the elected president of that country. And so I think that does deserve a degree of respect. That doesn't mean we have to agree with his policies, but it does deserve a degree of respect. In terms of how we need to respond to things, look, again, sometimes, I think for the last 105 days, we've seen a lot of extreme over dramatization of these issues. And we talk about Trump being unpredictable. I don't agree with a lot of things that he's done on Ukraine. I don't agree with the statements from Trump and from Vance on NATO, but I think those things are hardly unpredictable. In fact, if you track the things that he was saying in the lead up to his inauguration, a lot of those things were predictable. In the same way that the tariffs have been predictable. Again, not a good decision for the economy. I'm not an economist, but I think we just need to avoid kind of over dramatizing the issue. On the security aspect, look, there's been a lot of statements saying that the US is an unreliable ally because of Trump's unpredictability. But I don't think from an Australian perspective right now, we are seeing anything that makes the US an unreliable ally. That might change in the future, okay? But when we look at the disentanglement to a certain extent from NATO, and yes, JD Vance's comments in the Munich Security Conference were quite confronting, right? And quite offensive, of course. But when we've seen the comments from Marco Rubio, what we've seen is a message from the US that Europe needs to be responsible for its own conventional defence. It needs to increase defence spending. And we've seen reassertions from the Secretary of State, who's also now the National Security Advisor of the US, that the US is still responsible for the nuclear deterrent aspect. Of course, though, there needs to be trust from Europe that that actually exists. Those messages about Europe spending more and being responsible for its own conventional defence have been going on for a long time. In fact, I found a quote for a recent op-ed from Condoleezza Rice in 2000, before she became the National Security Advisor, talking about this as an issue. That doesn't mean that the things that JD Vance said is okay, or Pete Hegseth, but it means they're not necessarily unpredictable. When we think about the US alliance with Australia and where is that and what is the messaging we're seeing, look, we've had trade disputes with the US on and off for a long time. The tariffs issue, absolutely. Again, I'm not an economist. I think it's ridiculous, especially the idea of taxing penguins. I mean, just, how do you respect that? But again, when you look at the tariffs issue, it's not like Australia was singled out. Australia was grouped in, okay? And the impact, the direct impact on our economy right now, the economists are saying, isn't huge. Now, the indirect impact could be, and Gareth's right, the impact on the Chinese economy will have a direct impact on us. But again, we kind of need to play that as we see it. Actually, despite the kind of pomp and ceremony and ridiculousness of a lot of Trump's assertions about tariffs, what we've actually seen play out is most of that kind of back down. I mean, you see the press conference today between the new Prime Minister of Canada, Carney, and Trump. Actually, it was quite cordial. So I think just keeping the temperature down, not responding over the top, and playing things we've seen is probably the biggest thing that Australia needs to think about. On issues like AUKUS and issues like our entanglement with the US, look, I agree. We certainly do need to have more self-reliance within the alliance. And I don't actually think there's many defense specialists that would disagree with that. We have taken benefits from the end of the Cold War. We've not invested in our own capability. I don't think we're ever structured to be as reliant on the US as we have become, whether that is on US equipment or whether that is on US capability more broadly. And so certainly we need to do that, but that requires investment and that requires an articulation to the Australian public as to why they should invest. And again, when we talk about, we talk about the US and the threat of the unpredictability of Trump, it's not a US plane or a US ship that is putting the lives of the women and the men of our Australian Defence Force at risk in international airspace and waters. That is Chinese assets. And again, I don't think that we're about to be invaded anytime soon. I don't think there's about to be a major conflict tomorrow. But we need to be realistic about those challenges and the aggression that China is displaying in the region and how that impacts Australia's national interests. As Gareth mentioned, Australia has benefited a lot from the international order and from international law, and that's something that China is seeking to undermine. So we also need to be clear-eyed about that. So I think that, again, if I was to say what I think our biggest risk is, it's actually the way we react to things, how we over-dramatize things and potentially make a bigger issue of things than they may be.
Fantastic, thanks, Jennifer. There is a degree of which we've seen this show before, and yet it still shocks us in a way in which it perhaps shouldn't. That is to say, the gap between what the Trump administration says and what it in fact does. Hugh, your sense about that opening immediate sense of challenge that we face?
Yeah, look, thanks, Nick. It's great to join Gareth and Jen on this occasion, and always great to be, so to speak, at least metaphorically, under Rob Mann's baton as we undertake this conversation. Look, I think the principal challenge we face in relation to Trump is to recognise that the real problem we face with the United States is not Trump. It's much bigger shifts in the fundamentals, the geostrategic, the economic fundamentals of global order, which I think have a really significant long-term effects for the kinds of roles we can expect the United States to play globally, in our region, and in Australia's security. Now, that's not to say that I don't think Trump is important. I agree with everything Gareth said about the way, about all the shocking things about Trump. And there are a couple of observations worth making about that. The first is that, after the first term, it was possible to imagine, when he lost to Biden, it was possible to imagine that Trump was an aberration. Of course, we can't think that now. The second point to make is that although Trump himself is obviously in some weird, distasteful way a truly formidable politician, his success, the extent to which he's managed to achieve this remarkable position in US politics, does point to very significant fragilities in the wider US political system, which I, at least, didn't detect before Trump rode down that escalator in 2016. The fact that he was able to take over the Republican Party shows both what a remarkable politician he is and how feeble the Republican Party really was. The fact that the Democratic Party has not found a way to respond to him, the fact that they allowed themselves to put themselves in a position where it took that horrible debate for the Democrats to realise that Joe Biden wasn't the man to beat Trump. And the fact that now, 100+ days into his second term, the Democratic Party seems to find no way to talk about Trump even. Tells us that something was wrong in American politics that made it so vulnerable to Trump, and that's something that we should pay careful attention to. But even more broadly, the fact is that whether Donald Trump had won the election last November or not, the forces that undermine our confidence, that should undermine our confidence, that the United States will continue to play the same role in Asia and the same role in Australia's security that we've relied on it playing, roughly speaking, since Pearl Harbor. Those are still there. They were there under the Biden administration. The United States has no answer to China's power and ambition in East Asia. It has shown no capacity to mount an effective response to China's challenge. And to my mind, the great lesson we draw from Trump's success in terms of Australia's security is that there's a reason for that. The reason why the United States has not been able to respond effectively is that the US public doesn't buy the idea that it's important enough to America to preserve its leadership role in Asia, for it to accept, shoulder the costs and risks entailed in doing that. Just as it has not been able to shoulder the costs and risks entailed in preventing Putin from winning real results from his invasion of Ukraine, where they're not prepared to shoulder the burdens, to bear any burden and pay any price to sustain its position in Asia in the face of China's challenge. And so I think the real challenge for Australian governments is to recognise that the real challenge we face is not Trump. It's much deeper than that. And that our political leaders have so far, on both sides of politics, have so far failed, I think, to understand that. If they understand it, they certainly haven't tried to share that understanding with the Australian public, and to start formulating a response to it, which acknowledges the depth of the challenges that we face. And I guess we'll get into what some of those might be later in our conversation.
Can I just come back in?
Yeah, Gareth, go for it.
Look, while there are obviously deeper issues with the American psyche, which Hugh rightly identifies, I think you and Jennifer are both understating the particular significance of Trump's additional devalue added to the equation. And in particular, this sense that great power sphere of influence. I mean, what's driven his absolute tolerance of Russia's naked aggression against Ukraine on a scale that was unthinkable under previous administrations, Democrat administrations, is his belief that basically great powers should be free to do their thing in their own sphere of influence. The whole distaste for international institutions, the UN, is again founded on this basic sense that they're useless encumbrances on great power freedom of action. I mean, it's not only Trump that has this sort of worldview. I mean, Paul Keating was a realist who plays footsie a little bit with these concepts of great power spheres of influence, and everybody can do their own thing within that. But I think, Jennifer, you ought to be worried about this, because this has real significance for letting China do its own thing. I mean, Trump wants to wage economic war against China, but it's not at all clear that he's seriously in the business of operating as any kind of effective counterbalance. We haven't seen any seriously credible, coherently articulated Asia policy under this administration. And we've seen attitudes towards his Asian allies, in particular the Southeast Asians, with tariff impositions in the 30 to 50% range, which are absolutely at odds with any coherent approach to reinforcing their status as supporters in pushing back against Chinese territorial and other international law aggressive behavior. I mean, this concept is really at the heart of it, I think. And this is more of a Trump thing than just an American thing, although it's always been there as a strand in American history. It's been articulated and now being implemented on a scale, greater than I think we've ever seen. And that's more troubling than it's ever seen, because I have a completely different view about the world order and about our responsibility as good international citizens generally to deal with decency issues across the spectrum under whoever's, regional order reach they may be. Anyway, I've said enough.
Yeah.
Context.
And that outlook of if you take it through, that outlook of a spheres of influence view of the world in which the powerful do what they will within their sphere, is very much at odds with not just the basic structure of US foreign policy since the war, but its command structure, the way the State Department is set up, the way that the Ministry of Defence, the State Department of Defence has set up its military posture. So it is something of a break. So Jen, did you just want to come quick reply?
I will offer some comments. I mean no offense, Gareth, but I'm often told by older gentlemen, generally not older women, that I underestimate things. So there is potentially a theme there, and generally it's politicians. Look, I don't think I'm underestimating the issue. I
Oh,
just have a
Huey was
different.
underestimating it too, but anyway, there you go.
I,
Yeah.
I just,
I was
I
an
just have
equal
a.
opportunity offender in that respect.
Hmm. I just have a different view to you. And I think that I'm concerned about Trump. I'm concerned about the fact that the US doesn't seem to understand that in order to be effective in this region, they need to align all aspects of national power. I think they have been stronger in some ways on the defense and security aspects. I think moving of certain equipment, including NASAMS and Nemesis, into the Indo-Pacific sends a message. I think the US Secretary of Defense visit in February to the Philippines and Japan sends a message. I think some of the messaging from the State Department towards China sends a message. I think the issue is that that is obviously not consistent with the messaging that is sent by the US aid issues, which I agree. I mean, that completely undermines their position in the region, and not consistent with the initial messaging of the tariffs, although they've backed down a lot of the key countries. It's counterproductive. They clearly don't have a grand strategy. But again, I don't think that we should be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And I think that we should be looking at each of the facts. And in some ways, from a defense perspective, they have been stronger on China under this administration.
Thank you. Just a quick.
Yeah, look, lot in this. I just want to make this point. I completely share with Gareth the thought that we'd be living in a better world if we didn't live in a world of great powers and spheres of influence. And I certainly agree that Trump is unusual in the frankness with which he embraces the idea of great powers and spheres of influence. Indeed, it's one of Trump's characteristics, and indeed the rest of his administration. I mean, Marco Rubio was very explicit about this. He does see the world not as a unipolar world under US leadership, but as a multipolar world of great powers, and those great powers are expected by Washington to behave as great powers do. The difference I'd have with that Gareth analysis, I think, is that we were moving into that world under Biden. The Biden did nothing effective, because we can see. I mean, although it was Trump that started the negotiations with Putin over Ukraine's future, it was under Biden that we acknowledged that there was nothing we were going to do. We, the West, the United States, was going to do to save Ukraine from having to enter into that negotiation, and in Asia. I would argue the United States has been prepared to do nothing effective to prevent China establishing a sphere of influence in East Asia and the Western Pacific. And so I think, although I absolutely agree that Trump's way of dealing with things is going to make this whole process much more difficult, it's going to make the outcome worse, I think very significantly worse. I do think we're anyway headed into a multipolar world of great powers, and those great powers are going to exercise their spheres of influence. It's always worth remembering that the great granddaddy of great power spheres of influence since 1824 has been the United States sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere under the Monroe Doctrine, and no American administration has ever repudiated that.
Yeah, and don't forget, Marco Rubio said during his confirmation hearings that the international order that exists no longer serves our interests, and in fact is being weaponized against us.
Yeah, that's right. That was his repudiation of the unipolar order, and instead he said in a later interview on Fox that we now live in a multipolar world. I mean, he said that absolutely explicitly, which is a very significant thing for an American statesman to say. And I do think that although Trump doesn't use that kind of language because he's not that kind of guy, the way in which he's conducting himself, I mean, actually very much as Gareth said, does point towards him seeing that. Now, the key thing to draw from that, though, is that given that we do live in a multipolar world, and I think we do, that's what the vast power shift of the last 25 years was all about, then it's not Trump that's pushing us into a multipolar world. It's China's rise. It's India's rise. It's Russia's residual power, notwithstanding its many weaknesses. It's the re-emergence of Europe as a unified strategic actor. These are the things that are driving us into a multipolar world, not Trump by himself.
So I want to return to those larger themes in a second, but I'd like to just draw in a little bit more specifically on the question of the alliance, which is the headline item on the discussion. And I might start with you, Hugh, because just to connect with your opening comments about the sort of longer term uncertainty about the match between US strategy in the region, the nature of the region, its stomach for the fight, so to speak. Can Australia still rely on the alliance, which has been at the heart of its defence and foreign policy for essentially since it was signed in the 1950s?
Look, Nick, I don't think we can, and I don't think we can in two ways, because always worth remembering, we rely on the United States under the alliance to do two related but separate things. The first is to provide, what one might call rather loosely the security guarantee, the thing that's embodied under Article 4 of the ANZUS Treaty to act to meet the common danger in accordance with our constitutional processes. That is the thought that if Australia was actually directly attacked, then the United States would come to our assistance. The other thing the United States has done, which has actually been much more important to us, has been to provide that underpinning, the stabilizing underpinning in East Asia and the Western Pacific, which has made us so secure that we haven't really had to worry about whether or not we were going to be attacked. The fact is the key thing the United States has done for us under ANZUS since it was signed in 1951 has been to help to support the US presence in the region, which has kept the region more broadly stable and secure, and that has kept us free of having to worry about any direct attack. Now, my response to your question would be, in neither of those ways can we depend on the United States as we have. The United States, the fact is that as China's power has grown, the cost and risk to the United States of continuing to play that stabilizing role in the region has increased, and the imperatives for the United States to do so have not increased. They've declined, because this isn't the Cold War. They don't face the risk that that China, unlike in the Cold War, where they faced the risk that the Soviet Union could have ended up dominating the whole of Eurasia because it was so much stronger than any other country in Eurasia. Although China doesn't pose that threat, because although it's a very strong country, it's not going to be strong enough to dominate Russia or India or Europe, or for that matter, Japan or the countries of Southeast Asia. So I do think there's a very significant difference and a much lower imperative for the United States to play that kind of role in Asia than what it used to play. So I think, we are kidding ourselves if we think the United States is still going to be the kind of dominant power in Asia 20 years from now than it was 20 years ago. And 20 years is a relatively short time frame in this business. The second point I'd make is that in relation to the sort of direct security guarantee to Australia, one never wants to emphasize, to imagine that countries come to one another's defense because they like the cut of their jib or share values or whatever. They come to other countries' assistance where it counts, where real costs and risks are on the table. They do it if their interests require it. Now, if the United States would only ever defend Australia if it required access to Australia as part of its posture in the Western Pacific. If the United States does not seek to preserve a primary position in the Western Pacific, then it doesn't need Australia. And if it doesn't need Australia, there's absolutely no reason for us to expect it to defend us. And it's always worth remembering that the great strategic educational moment, teaching moment for Australia was the fall of Singapore in February 1942. Now, I don't blame the British for the fact that they didn't come to our aid in 1942. They had something else on. I blame the Australian politicians in the 1930s who could see Britain's vulnerability, could see the fact that Britain's imperatives to defend us didn't match the costs and risks involved for them to do so if they were facing a European war, and we nonetheless depended on them. And I think those in Australia, including both sides of politics, who argue that we should continue to depend on the United States for the next 20 or 30 years, the way we have for the last 20 or 30 years, when the circumstances are so different, are not taking their job seriously.
Certainly the echo of the 1930s is one you hear mentioned regularly about the current particular moment.
Yeah, I mean, these are the guys who keep on saying, and they do keep on saying, we face the most demanding strategic circumstances since the 1930s or since the Second World War, and they don't then go on and ask themselves, what does that mean? Why is it true? Why are these circumstances more demanding? It's precisely because the United States is no longer the power in Asia that it used to be. And it's not that the United States has declined. I'm not a declinist as far as the United States economically, or for that matter, strategically is concerned. It's just that the others have risen. And that's, the rise of China remains one of the most fundamental shifts in our broad international circumstances since Europeans settled this continent in 1788. And we still keep on pretending that it makes no fundamental difference to our strategic circumstances because we can rely on America to dominate it. I don't think that makes sense.
Jen, based on your opening comments, I suspect you disagree with Hugh. So give you a chance to put your...
I agree with most of Hugh's comments, but I disagree that the US is now an unreliable ally. Certainly, we are in a multipolar world. I mean, that's just the reality of the situation. That's not since the Trump administration. That's been happening for a while. And we've seen that through the things like the decline of the United Nations and things like that, which just don't work in a multipolar world. And, how limited the UN has been in terms of effectiveness in dealing with what's happening in the Middle East or what's happening in Europe, etc. I think that in terms of the US, though, I don't think that Australia needs to rely on US primacy in the region. I mean, that's clearly not realistic. But what Australia does need to rely on is certainly a balance of power in the region. And as much as we may not be to the point of US primacy, or certainly US primacy into the future, we certainly are in the point of the US balancing China. And we're seeing that it's not true to say that the US is not interested in this region. Everything that they are doing from a defense perspective, whether it's upgrading their command in Japan, whether it's reinforcing their support to the Philippines, shows that they are interested. And they have a number of economic reasons to be interested. I think it's prudent to continually assess whether the alliance is the best decision. Of course, alliances don't last forever. And it is, important to reassess the underlying assumptions under your strategy. But I think when we assess those assumptions right now, there's nothing that we're seeing in the US alliance that makes them any more unreliable than they have been previously. There've been plenty of times in our history where the US have let us down. And I think that many times Australia has read more into what the ANZUS treaty actually means than the US have, right? And we saw that in East Timor. We've seen that during issues where we needed satellite support and it was moved. There's all sorts of issues where the US has let us down. I think the lesson there is to understand what we want out of the alliance and then look at how we need to bolster our defences and our relationships in the region to mitigate the other aspects. So, if I was going to put the key line up front, I don't think the US is any more unreliable than they have been. I think our strategic interests are aligned now. I think that they will continue to support us, but we have often read into what that support is a lot more than the US has.
Yeah.
Well, acknowledged unreliability in the past doesn't give us an awful lot of confidence that the picture will be any different in the future. And I'm of the school which says it's simply a comforting fantasy that ANZUS means that the United States will be there for us in any way if they don't see their own interests as immediately at stake in any kinetic conflict in which we might be involved. I think that's the reality, and I can't see that changing. There's a few more US interests are accumulating in Australia. It's not just the Pine Gap Intelligence Facility, it's now Stirling and it's now Tyndall and it's now Darwin, and that's painting a few more targets on our back to which the Americans might be disposed to respond in some way in defence of those particular assets and interests. But the notion of any kind of larger sense of commitment, if we were to be facing, in the unlikely event that we were to be facing some really existential risk, I just think it's I'm sorry, Jen, I do think it's a fantasy still to think that the US spots will change in that respect. As to your other point, I think we're in pretty close agreement here. I mean, the notion of the United States, as Hugh said, having a stabilizing role in the region over a very long period of time, and that being an asset to us and all of us, is a very real and a very credible point to make. I mean, occasionally there have been some lunatic misadventures by the United States in terms of that understanding of its role in the region, Vietnam conspicuously among them. But I am one who doesn't argue for the disappearance of the United States from the region. I'm very much in favour of the United States presence as a bit of a balancer. And I've supported from the outset things like the Quad, because the US, Japan, Australia, India combination, not because I see it as a serious military alliance, but because I see it as sending some very useful messages to the United States about the potential risks that are involved in overreach in the region. And I just do think it's important, and I've argued publicly for an embrace, not of restoration of US primacy, that's crazy, but not an untrammeled acceptance of Chinese primacy in its own sphere of influence. I'm very much in favor of trying to recreate that sense of détente which existed between the United States and the Soviet Union for such a critical period in the late Cold War, where there was a respect and an appreciation of the role that each of them had, and a capacity and a willingness up to a point to work together on some common issues of arms control and so on. And I do see that concept of détente as one that is achievable if enough people put their shoulder to the wheel. So I don't think we're in total disagreement about this, but the notion that, and I'm not one to argue for an Australian unilateral walking away from the alliance, because whatever else it might do for us, it does, still offer us, I think, real advantages, as I said at the outset, in intelligence and logistic and technical support. But the notion of the alliance as some sort of snoopy conflict comfort blanket for all of us is just, I'm afraid, not just nonsense, but what Jeremy Bentham would call nonsense on stilts.
Can I just...
Yeah, quickly, Hugh. So Hugh and then Jen, and then I'll
because I just wanted to pick up on the point that both Gareth and Jen raised about the idea of the United States staying in the region to balance, even if it's not going to stay in the region to lead or dominate as it used to. I absolutely agree with both of them. That would be a very desirable outcome. I'd much rather live in an Asia in which the United States continue to play a significant role to help balance and moderate China's power. I don't think, though, that prudent Australian policy should rely on that happening, because I think it's clear that China doesn't want that, and China can impose costs and risks on the United States. And so the question is going to be, is the United States willing to bear the burdens, pay the costs to stay in Asia, even as a balancer, let alone to dominate? And I think the arguments that it's not are pretty strong, actually. I mean, it goes back to the point that Gareth brought up for us, and that is the way in which Trump and his people accept the idea of spheres of influence, accept the idea that China has a right to dominate East Asia and the Western Pacific the way that America dominates the Western Hemisphere. And we can see how much Trump likes that idea, us Canadians. But I also think, I spent quite a lot of time, many years, in fact, some years ago, wrote a book called The China Choice, which was all about America sharing power with China in Asia. And I spent quite a lot of time in the United States talking to Americans of all shapes, sizes, and descriptions about that idea. And I never met an American who thought it was a good idea for the United States to share power with China in Asia. They regarded it as a kind of a non sequitur. And so I think you've got to be very skeptical about whether the Chinese are going to accept it, and very skeptical about whether the Americans are going to accept it. I think for the United States, if it ain't dominating, it's out of there. And that we should actually, I think, as a diplomatic enterprise, try and encourage the United States, and for that matter China, to accept that kind of balanced order. But I don't think for a moment that we can depend on that happening.
And don't forget the détente that Gareth is referring to is seen in the American political environment as a near failure. I mean, it's seen as not something to be repeated.
But it's also worth bearing in mind that détente was based on an acceptance by both sides of the other spheres of influence. Yeah, that détente worked because the Americans were going to stay out of the Soviet bloc, and the Soviets were going to stay out of what you might call the American bloc. Now, we can have détente between the US and China, but that won't be a détente which sees the United States stay engaged to constrain China's power in what China sees as its sphere of influence. Now, it's very important to stress here, I'm not saying I like the idea of living in a Chinese sphere of influence. I don't. But I think that's what Australian policymakers should be planning for, because that seems to me to be far away the most likely outcome.
Jen, over to you.
Look, there are plenty of hypotheticals, and we would all be much richer if we could accurately predict the future. Look, I can only assess whether the US remain in this region based on what they're currently doing. And based on what they're currently doing is they are investing in staying in this region, whether that is through the force posture initiatives with Australia that have ramped up since 2012, whether that is with the relationships and the AUKUS sites in the Philippines that have ramped up, the increased investment, the acceleration of the command structure in Japan, etc. We are not seeing a US that is withdrawing from this region. Now, don't get me wrong, as I mentioned before, I think that when it comes to their grand strategy, it is a bit confused because when you look at the economic impacts, the aid impacts, they're certainly not aligning all aspects of national power, and that is undermining their ability to compete with China. Now, I hate the term compete because I don't think China thinks they're competing, but it is the common parlance. So I don't think we're seeing a US that is withdrawing, and I think a US that withdraws from this region would be putting their own economic and national security interests at risk. I do want to address the idea, though, that the relationship with the US is putting targets on our back. It is not the US's behavior that is fundamentally changing the security of this region. I think China is incredibly important to Australia. I think that we need to be working on our relationship with China, et cetera, et cetera. But it is China's behavior in the region that is changing the security in the region. Yes, of course, they've always had the same position for a long time on Taiwan, but the nature of which they've been talking about potential invasions of Taiwan, the nature of their military demonstrations, which they're doing twice a year and are getting more and more aggressive, the nature at which they've dealt with the Philippines, etc. It is China that is challenging things that actually impact Australia's national security interests. So I think that the US integration and rotation through some of our bases is actually bolstering our defence. I don't think it's putting a target on our back, because for Australia to avoid having a target on its back in a region where China continues to accelerate its aggression and dominate the region through military power and coercion, for Australia to accept that, we would need to accept that we are no longer a middle power with a degree of autonomy. We no longer have the influence on the national stage that we have enjoyed. So I don't agree that things like AUKUS, things like Pine Gap put a target on our back. They give us the capability to defend ourselves in a wildly deteriorating region.
I think, with due respect, Jennifer, you've got to be a bit more specific about and a bit more credible about the basic threats to Australia that are involved in this Chinese behaviour. It's unquestionably unsavoury for all of us in relation to Taiwan, flourishing democracy. It's obviously unsavoury in the context of the South China Sea and the territorial push that's going on there, in a way that is in complete breach of international law, with the law of the sea. But how much of this is likely ever to translate into serious military threat to Australia? Or how much even to the other countries of Southeast Asia or the wider Asian region, apart from Taiwan itself? I mean, how real is that particular threat? I mean, I just don't get it. Yes, there's all sorts of other interests that China wants to pursue. It wants to be the hegemon. It wants to have the whole region kowtowing and acknowledging all sorts of things about its supremacy and a function of the last 2,000 years. Yes, all of that. But where's the military threat in all of this? It seems to me the only military threat that Australia is going to face if we get sucked into joining the US in a military enterprise to defend Taiwan, in an environment where we can't contribute anything more than at the extreme margin to the military outcome, and we'll certainly lose a lot of treasure in the process with the complete collapse of our trade relationship with China. I mean, and the only thing that will follow from our military engagement is the potential targeting of Australian facilities that are supportive of the American enterprise. I mean, I think you've just, rather than just making the usual noise of ASPI and NSC and defence and intelligence poobahs about the threat, I think you've got to be a bit more specific about the reality of that threat.
So Jen, be more specific. Go for it.
Sure. I mean, I've spent 20 years defending our country, so I think my comments are credible. In terms of that threat, I don't think the commanding officer of HMAS Brisbane, whose aircraft was up in the Yellow Sea, monitoring UN sanctions, is unclear about where the threat is when a Chinese fighter aircraft in international space deploys flares in front of a helicopter. So I think that we just need to be a little bit understanding of what is actually happening on the ground. And these things have been happening for a long time. Yes, the Australian government in 2022 decided to announce some of these incidents and has done subsequently, but that kind of aggressive behaviour has been happening in the region for a very long time towards our own women and men serving in the Australian Defence Force, protecting the interests of this country. That threat is real. Now, in terms of how does it impact our interests, look, I agree there is no credible threat to any sort of invasion of Australia. And I think when people talk about territorial defence of Australia and echidna strategies and stuff, I think they miss the point. But what we've seen through China's economic coercion, what we've seen through their harassment and putting at risk our women and men in the Australian Defence Force in international airspace and in international waters, and I have seen it with my own eyes, what we risk is a country in the region who thinks it can use military power to threaten us and coerce us. In interfering with things like our maritime trade, etc., is not too many steps up in the event of a crisis or a potential conflict in the region than economic coercion. And when you think about our relationships in the region, we've talked about the importance of our relationships in the region. I think we agree on that. The things that are happening towards Japan, the things that are happening towards the Philippines, these are threats to Australia's national interests. So I think we need to think more broadly about what are Australia's vital interests and what it requires to defend them. And not underestimate the risk that the Chinese military puts our women and men in the ADF at every time they go into the South China Sea or further north of that and have done for the last 10 years. Those are just the facts on the ground.
All right, I want to take us to the topic that is probably the most requested, if that's the right term, from our registrants, and that's, of course, the AUKUS Pact that was signed by the Biden administration, the UK and Australia. And it's been controversial from the start, as Gareth alluded to, terribly expensive, promises high-end capabilities of the kind that up until very recently, the US, the old joke that the US Navy wouldn't share Virginia-class nuclear power technology with the US Army kind of used to hold the day. The fact that they're prepared to share it with Australia was a real, I think, for a lot of people who watch this closely, a pretty surprising, shocking in the literal sense of, oh my gosh, this is quite something. So I thought perhaps we'd start with a broader question around what you all think about the prospects of AUKUS delivering. And then turn to the question of, does the Trump administration exacerbate those risks, improve them? And then we can talk a little bit more about some longer term planning if we need to get there. So, Jen, I know this is closest to your wheelhouse. So I might start with you. You've written a lot about AUKUS, both scholarly work and in sort of broader press. How reliable do you think AUKUS is? Will we get those submarines with Australian flags on them sailing into the various submarine bases in the 2030s? And the Virginia class submarines of phase 2. What's your sense of it?
Look, I think this, it's been really good to see a national debate on AUKUS, and I think it's something that people should be passionate about. And I think in many ways, the way in which it was announced probably undermined its standing within Australia and within the region. I think that's unfortunate. I think that nuclear-powered submarines are a good direction for Australia, and this has been debated in kind of naval folklore for the last 60 years, right? And really it comes down to a factor of geography and what are the capabilities we need to protect our maritime domain. Of course, the decision to allow us to have that technology was very much influenced about the US's concerns about China. I guess when I think about will these submarines be delivered or not, I just have to look at where are we right now? And I've got to say, since the announcement in September 21, things have been largely on track. And I don't think we should underestimate how significant some of those achievements have been. We talked about announcing the optimal pathway. I know some people would say it's not optimal. I think it's fine, but I get that is a debate within 18 months, and that was done. We managed to get 3 countries to agree a treaty on this issue, which is, no mean feat. We have significant numbers of Australian officers and sailors that are training in the US now to support it. And the list goes on in terms of the achievements. So I think you need to acknowledge that this is ambitious. You need to acknowledge that there is risk. Of course, there is risk. There is significant risk with all large defence projects. But when you look at that risk, you've got to ask yourself the question is the risk being mitigated right now? And when I point to the facts on the ground, I can't see anything that is not mitigating that risk. Now, that doesn't mean it won't change. So where I come to from that is I do think, certainly when we come to phase one, which is submarine rotation force west, which is the rotation of US submarines out of HMAS Sterling, I think we will get there in 2027. When we come to phase two, which is the sale of 3 to 5, probably 3 Virginia-class submarines to Australia in the 30s, I do think we will get there. And I know a lot of people make a lot about the US submarine industrial base. And I've got to say, yes, the US has significant issues in its submarine industrial base and its shipbuilding industrial base. A lot of those issues come from underinvestment. There have been a number of executive orders now from Trump trying to address this. Now, whether it will, I mean, there's a flow of executive orders and a lot of them don't necessarily end up meaning anything. But there has been more of a focus on addressing this issue in the shipbuilding submarine industrial base than there was under the previous administration. So I think that is a net positive. I don't believe the argument that if the US is not on track to have 66 submarines by 2054, there is no way they would sell 2 to 3 Virginias to Australia in the 30s. Because when you think about capability, it's not about numbers on a page, it's about holistic capability. And the ability to operate from Australia, the ability to have closer access to the key theatre of choice, which the US has said is the Indo-Pacific and South China Sea, I think is important. So I actually do think it is largely on track. Now, in terms of the cost, and I know Gareth mentioned the cost, look, it is expensive, right? And part of the debate needs to be, is this necessarily the right direction given the cost? And it's unfortunate that we didn't have the debate before we were all announced. In fact, I was working in Force Design and Defence when it was announced and I didn't know about it. So I get that. But I think we also need to be really open about the cost as well. So $368 billion out to 2051, or it might be 2055. That includes acquisition and sustainment. That includes infrastructure, training, et cetera, et cetera. I often hear it compared to the French submarine project as, well, that was going to be $90 billion. Well, that's not true because that was acquisition. Actually, the last time it was mentioned in estimates, the French submarine project was mentioned to be at about 145 billion in terms of sustainment, right? So that's 235 billion. That was acknowledged to be probably an underestimate. Now, that was over a different time period, right? It was to 2080. But the point is, they're actually not orders of magnitude different. When we talk about that $368 billion, yeah, it's a huge figure. 50% of that is contingency. So when you plan a defense project, you normally have 5 to 10% contingency. That's kind of fudge factor because it might go over. This has a much larger contingency, right? So again, I'm not saying it's not expensive. It is expensive, but it's not in the orders of magnitude that people talk about. And you're often hearing apples and oranges compared. So I guess to answer your question, look, I do think it is on track. I can't say hand on heart that it will always remain on track, but I think we're seeing really good indications. And I think it is really important for Australia to make it happen. And the idea of backflipping now and going to the French or something like that would fundamentally undermine our relationship with the US, but it would also undermine our standing in the region as a reliable partner.
Yeah, it wouldn't be a good look to cancel 2 submarine projects and not just one. Gareth.
Well, on the deliverability issue, I think we've got to do better than just make a faith-based judgment because there is huge doubt about that industrial base capability of delivering the 3 Virginias on any kind of schedule, given the competing demands of the US system. And that's documented all over the place. I mean, they might get there, but it's a huge, huge, huge risk. And of course, that's only a small part of the total project. You then move to the new design and build of the AUKUS model. And frankly, with due respect to the Brits, the last time they brought in a major defence project on time, on budget and on spec was, I think, World War II. So there's a real issue about deliverability. But then, of course, there are 2 other big issues. It's not just cost, it's cost as against benefit. Now, what are the benefits of these great big beasts? I mean, nuclear propulsion is wonderful compared with conventional propulsion in terms of longevity, endurance, speed, and all the rest of the things we talk about. But can we make assumptions about undetectability of these things in 30, 40 years' time? There's a real question mark there. Might we not be better off putting our emphasis on uncrewed, unmanned operations of this kind, particularly if we don't see an absolute necessity for these things to operate as far afield as the current thinking is that they've got to be up there on those choke points in the South China Sea. So the issue of benefit is if we get 8 of these boats in 40 years' time, all of them come on stream, it is the reality, is it not, Jennifer, that only 2 of those will be able to be operationally deployed at any given time on normal assumptions about submarine workability. Now, given the vast maritime terrain that we have to, sphere that we have to defend, I mean, what is the advantage as compared with spending a similar amount of money on a far, far greater attention to aircraft, to other kinds of capabilities. I mean, missiles and drones, and including undersea capability. I mean, it all goes. There's a real issue about not just cost, but cost as against benefit. And the final point that does need to come into play here, and the third big objection, is and to me, really the knockout one, and I've been saying this from the outset, is the loss of sovereign agency, which I think is absolutely endemic in this particular enterprise. The United States is not going to transfer this kind of extraordinarily sensitive technology to us, except on the assumption that those boats are going to be available at the flick of a presidential finger, should the United States want them to be used in concert with themselves in any kinetic enterprise in which they might be involved in our region. And frankly, I just don't think that's a position we ought to be getting ourselves into. We haven't thought it through sufficiently, and we haven't thought through the implications. And I'll tell the story again because it's influenced my own thinking. You talk about your own experience, Jen, as a naval officer. I think of my own experience as foreign minister dealing with the Americans in a kinetic conflict in which we were allies and partners and engaged in a joint operation, and that was the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, the good Gulf War, 1991, when we rushed off quite sensibly and legitimately to support the operation against Iraq after its invasion of Kuwait. We sent a couple of boats, you'll remember, into that sphere together with some other personnel. And as you're probably aware of the history, within the first day of their arrival on the scene, they were ordered by the Americans into a particularly vulnerable location. I called Jim Baker, my counterpart, Secretary of State, said, Jim, we're completely on board with the strategic imperative here, and we know that military necessity, is obviously critical. But we really, given this could turn pear-shaped for us very quickly, we really would have appreciated just a little bit of consultation about this particular deployment. To which the response was, and I'll bowdlerize it a little bit, listen, buddy, we're running this effing war, not you. And this is the reality of dealing with the Americans in this sort of situation. We are very much junior, second-order players in the scheme of things. And the notion that we retain any serious sovereign independence and the application of the use of these great big useful beasts is I think, a very, very problematic assumption. And that's based on my own experience. And I have to say that's had a pretty searing impact on my judgment about the necessity and utility of maintaining our sovereign agency, our sovereign independence when we're talking about military assets of this capability.
But I think Jen's point that at the start, the announcement of the fait accompli was pretty problematic, as she said, this foreclosed thinking through the
Well, it didn't foreclose a serious review of it when the government came into office. It did foreclose it in the 3 months before the election because nobody on the Labor side was going to get caught up in a khaki election. That was perfectly understandable. Everyone understood that. But what was missing was any kind of serious review. And frankly, another such review is now overdue. It's still not too late to do that. I do agree with Jen. I think the talk of abandoning the AUKUS project in favour of going back to the French and the 12 submarines and so on that Peter Briggs, the Admiral, talks about quite sensibly in technical terms, I think that's probably politically untenable and also probably logistically untenable given the time that's already elapsed and the need for some kind of effective capability in the future. But it was a political judgment. It was an opportunistic enterprise by the Morrison government. Labor got sucked in, but the trouble is we've stayed sucked in and we haven't made any serious attempt to disengage from what I think is a misconceived enterprise.
Hugh, quick thoughts on AUKUS.
Well, look, I haven't been a fan of AUKUS for since the outset. I don't think nuclear-powered submarines are, as a matter of capability design, the most cost-effective option for Australia. I think a larger fleet of conventional boats would deliver more capability for less money. That's partly based on the judgment that I don't buy Jen's numbers on submarine costs. I agree there's a lot of uncertainty about that, but we do have an interesting price comparison. The Dutch have signed a contract for 4 of the French boats that we were going to buy. for about 10 billion bucks. 4 for 10 billion, that's 30 billion for 12. Now that's clearly obviously just the sail away price, but multiplied by 3, which is the usual number that we used to use, at least when I was doing this stuff in defence, that means 100 billion bucks for that's the full life price for the 12 boats. I actually think you could get a decent conventional submarine for even less than I think there's a much more attractive option to build a bigger fleet of conventional boats, which each boat wouldn't be as capable, but the whole fleet would be more capable, and it's the capability of the fleet that wins battles and wins campaigns. But also on the reliability point, look, I think there are 3. Jen is absolutely right. All defence projects are risky, and I might say submarine projects are particularly risky because they're very difficult beasts. But I do think this project has 3 very specific points of weakness. The first one is at home in Australia. I think the demands on the Royal Australian Navy to provide nuclear capable crews for these submarines as they're supposed to come into service on the optimum pathway is extraordinarily demanding for a service which has got an awful lot else going on. The idea that Australian industry is going to develop the capacity not just to build submarines, but to build nuclear-powered submarines and to sustain nuclear-powered submarines in Australia with the extraordinary safety and security overheads that go with it is an additional very big risk. That's just on the Australian end. And I might say embedded in that is the question as to whether we can sustain even our conventional submarine capability through to the relevant period in the 30s, because the life of type extension for the Collins is itself a highly risky project. Our capacity to keep submarines at sea and therefore keep submariners trained is very much open to doubt. So I think on the whole Australian side, there are huge risks. Then there's the United States. I do buy the argument that the chances of the United States being able to deliver the kinds of numbers of built submarines at not just Virginia's, but the fact that they're also trying to build new class of ballistic missile firing submarines at the same time. This is extraordinarily demanding, even with a very competent administration run by a Secretary of Defense who knew his business. This would be a long shot. The Pete Hegseth's Pentagon? Really? I don't think so. And even if they did, of course, I think that there is no strategic rationale for the United States to send submarines to us when they have too few submarines themselves. And then there's the British part of it. And I do think the chances of the British being able to deliver the AUKUS submarine in the schedule required, particularly in the light of the fact that they themselves are trying to replace the upholders with the dreadnoughts, the British nuclear submarine enterprise as a whole is in very bad shape. We've seen, for example, the problems in the reactor industry, which has been highlighted in recent months. It's not, as I say before, and Jen is absolutely right, all defence projects are risky, but this one embeds a very wide range of risks across a very wide range of points. No serious project manager could look at this and think this is a worthwhile gamble, in particular because we don't really need nuclear-powered submarines to start with. And it's always worth bearing in mind the decision to go for AUKUS, made as it was in the Prime Minister's office, was not about submarines. It was about the alliance with the United States. It was about tightening that connection with the United States as the United States responds to China's challenge. And I think fundamentally that's a dumb thing to do because I don't think the United States response to China's challenge is working. And you know, this is Jen makes the point, the United States has been doing some things in Asia, and they have. But what they've been doing in Asia compared to what the Chinese have been doing, if you look at the shift in relative military positions between the US and China, go back to 1996, the last time they nearly went to war. The Americans were up there and the Chinese were down here, and the Chinese have gone like that. Now, if the Americans had gone like that, we'd be having a different conversation. But precisely because the United States, whatever they've done, have not done enough to offset the massive increase in China's capability. The fact is, nobody in Washington now seriously believes the United States could win a war against China over Taiwan. And if you can't win that war, then it's really dumb to start fighting it. And so the idea that what we do in responding to China's challenge is to align ourselves more and more closely with a US approach to China, which I think is strategically delusional, is itself, for Australia, delusional.
So I want to cover off a few more things. We've got only about 15 minutes left, but I did want to give Jen just a chance to respond on the sovereignty question, because I know this is a big part of the sort of broader public debate. So Jen, give us your
15 minutes. I need 15 hours, I suspect.
You need to be quicker than 15 minutes, because I want to cover off a few more things.
I will be quick. Look, in a previous life, my speciality was anti-submarine warfare. Conventional submarines, I agree, have a certain place. I think they've always been a challenge for Australia and will continue to be. So it takes 9 days for an Australian submarine to get from Sydney to Perth. A conventional submarine dive is much faster, half that for a nuclear-powered submarine, and at high speed, less than that. Same kind of distances to get to the Sunda Strait. I don't think we're buying nuclear-powered submarines to go and play up in the Taiwan Strait or things like that. We're buying nuclear-powered submarines because Australia's geography means that we need a faster vessel with higher endurance. And we've always struggled to build submarines that actually suit Australia's geography, right? The Collins class had to be a large submarine and it didn't really work. I won't bore everyone with that. On the sovereignty question, look, Australia has made certain decisions about our defence industrial base. Sovereignty for a middle power, and I'm sure, Gareth, you would agree with me, is not an absolute. It is a spectrum of how much you are willing to give away for what benefit. We do not design our own missiles. We don't design our own combat systems in our warships. In fact, we can't even amend them ourselves. Our defence industrial base is highly dependent on the US. We have made the decision to give up certain aspects to have that benefit. And that is the trade-off that middle powers and smaller powers make. This idea of this absolute thing of sovereignty, I think, is just not existent for countries like Australia. I do agree that we need the responsibility and the ability to direct our own assets. And look, I certainly respect your experience on Gulf War I, and I've seen many times where the US, and there's many times documented throughout history, World War II, where the US has not put Australia first. Absolutely. But we're not asking them to put Australia first. We're just asking them for them to consider us. And we need to be able to push back as well. I do not agree that buying nuclear-powered submarines gives up any more sovereignty than we have already given up in terms of the way we have designed our defence industrial base. And if we want to address that, then we're going to have to ramp up defence spending a lot more than we currently have. And we're not talking 2.5 or 3%. We're talking much higher than that.
All right, I want to turn to the more sharp issue that Gareth flagged at the top, which is the more immediate issue, rather. That's to say, the economic turmoil that is roiling markets at the moment, the question of tariffs. None of us are economists, so I don't want to dig into the technical detail about tariffs, but also we don't know what they are. We don't know what the tariff deal is going to finish up with, apart from we know they're going to be higher than they currently are. But one issue that and I'm keen to get the sort of sense of the panelists on the broader process of what has happened with the tariffs. And in particular, I guess the starting point is Australia has a free trade agreement with the United States, whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing. But the reason we signed it in 2004 was to take the pebble out of the shoe that had been, as a number of people referred to, had long been an issue, right? Really the only major issue between the US and Australia that was a real irritant. And the free trade agreement was going to try to isolate that, solve that, and then we can get on with the kind of positivity that have been in place ever since. The US has clearly abrogated that, the Israel agreement, the Korea agreement, the Singapore agreement. Trump junked the own agreement he signed, the USMCA, which was the NAFTA 2.0 or the NAFTA reboot, however you want to style it. So what's your sense? And this is disconcerting both in the kind of chaos of policy, but also there's a really basic principle of international relations, that the treaty should be obeyed. You sign a treaty, you go into it with serious intent, and you do everything within your power to maintain your promise, because we all know what broken promises mean. And yet we have a serial liar, fibber, promise breaker in the White House. So if you could give a quick sort of immediate sense as to what this policy approach means for Australia and for good faith negotiation more generally, and then how should Australia respond to all of this? And I might just go, as I see you on the table, so to Gareth, and then Jen, and then to Hugh.
Well, self-evidently, a country that embraces a sense of arrogant exceptionalism where the rules apply to everybody else but not to itself, is not a country that wins a lot of respect or trust when it comes to a security relationship or an economic relationship or anything else. And that's the dilemma everybody is facing as the Trump administration careers down this path. Now, it may be just transactional, it might be bluff, and he might be willing to step back on a lot of this economic stuff that he's done, but he's already been tearing up specific agreements, as Nick has mentioned, and the auguries are not good. I mean, what's also sort of troubling about the whole tariff thing, and it's very, very clear from the reaction of our colleagues around Asia, the Southeast Asia, as I mentioned before, who've been hit with tariffs from 30 to 50%, much more immediately impactful on them than us, is the total uncertainty as to what the hell is going on here. And if you give me a second just to quote a beautiful couple of lines from a piece in Foreign Policy magazine a couple of days ago, I think this captures everything that's crazy about the current environment. And the quote is this: unspecified representatives from an unspecified list of countries are engaging with unspecified administration officials in Washington to make unspecified offers against unspecified demands in the hopes of winning unspecified concessions. Then the United States administration that treats compliance with its own treaties and commitments as largely optional might or might not implement to an unspecified degree for an unspecified period of time. I think that just beautifully captures the total lunacy of what's going on here and why so many people are so troubled by the breakdown in any kind of credible commitment to any kind of system of a rules-based order, whether it's in trade or anything else, and why so many people are worried about this administration. So I think in terms of Australia, I mean, our own approach to the tariff negotiation ought to be measured. There's no point in engaging in rhetorical overkill. It's likely to be quite counterproductive, and the immediate impact on us is not going to be, so great that it's unmanageable. But in terms of giving us any sense of confidence about the wider future, how this is going to affect our larger economic relationships because of the way it affects in turn China and everybody else, this is absolutely reason to be very, very seriously worried.
Jen.
Look, thank you. And I think this is probably one of the most challenging aspects. I mean, the US has done a lot to undermine their own position and their own reliability when it comes more broadly. The whole idea of an international rules-based order, look, I don't necessarily think that that's a thing. To be honest, I think there's international law, and I think people choose to comply or not comply with it based on the weight that they throw around. But I think this degradation in trust in the US that we will be seeing in this region, but we didn't start seeing it in this region from the Trump administration. We've actually been seeing it for a little while. In fact, the polling of 2024, when you looked at how the region reacted to the US's support for Israel in Gaza, showed that many of the Southeast Asian countries were actually losing trust in the US. So I don't necessarily think this is just a symptom of the Trump administration. There are some more visceral and obvious examples, but I think there is a symptom of the acknowledgement that the US is consistently at the moment in some areas saying one thing and doing another, and that is being noticed by the region. That is an issue. I think for us, in terms of can we trust the US, I think international relations and alliances are built on aligned strategic interests. And as long as our strategic interests are aligned, I think it'll be a bumpy road, clearly, with the current administration. But I think that we are in good standing. I think we do need to worry about, though, how reliable the region perceives the US. And I think that we need to, if the US wants to listen behind closed doors, be a counsel on how that's being perceived, but also work to strengthen our relationships in the region as a buttress against that.
Fantastic. Hugh.
Look, I do think the Trump administration is a truly remarkable, in fact, unprecedented international actor. I just don't think we have any precedent for a state, particularly a major state, that acted so irresponsibly. I mean, I think Gareth's quote actually put it perfectly. And I think, the reality is that this is not an administration you can deal with. And I think the idea that what we need to do is to work out a strategy for managing Trump. No, you can't work with these sorts of people. And so I think we should actually aim at the level of sort of, day-to-day contact with the administration. The aim should be to have as little contact with them as possible. But I just think worth making a broader point. And that is that I mean, there is no coherent policy behind the tariff shock and all the things that go with it. We don't really know what the United States is trying to achieve. There are several different things. Some people in the administration talk about trying to do a grand bargain with China. Some people in the administration talk about just trying to isolate China. I'm not quite sure what Trump wants. I think in a sense, he just wants to pull up the drawbridge and make America essentially autarkic. But there's one thing to be said, though, and that is that even the Trump administration is not immune to market forces. We saw that in the pullback from the Liberation Day announcements as soon as the bond market started going peculiar. And I do think one of the sort of bits of good news is that in the long run, Trump will be less disruptive economically than one fears at the moment, because he's swimming against the market. And in the end, markets have a power all their own, and a power I might not say that Trump in his wacky way acknowledges. And there is a difference there between Trump's strategic agenda and his economic agenda. The strategic agenda, he is actually swimming with the tide. The world is moving to a multipolar order, whether one likes it or not. And Trump's instincts, his attitudes, his dispositions pull him in that direction. Whereas he's swimming against the tide if he wants to make iPhones in America. I mean, you can make iPhones in America if you like, but they'll cost you $5,000 and they won't work. So why not buy the ones that are made in China or India? And I think in the short term, I mean, medium term, I think we're just going to have to sit this administration out because you can't work with them. But in the longer term, I'm less worried about the economic impacts of Trump's tariff madness than I might otherwise be, simply because I don't think the markets will let him get away with a lot of the stuff he's talking about.
Just a footnote on that very quickly. James Carville once famously said that in an afterlife he wanted to come back as the bond market, because as the bond market you can intimidate absolutely everybody. And I think that's the reality that Trump is going to face if nothing else is going to constrain him.
You always know when you're in trouble when a bunch of IR scholars are talking about the bond market. I wanted to finish referring to a sort of larger question that I think Australia really needs to think through, and probably has, as Hugh was hinting at earlier, probably should have been doing longer. And that's thinking, as an alliance partner, you always have a dilemma. You have the risks of being caught up in conflicts you might have avoided because of your alliance, but you also have the problem of abandonment. That's to say your alliance partner may desert you, and that's always the case, and that's not that's just the fact of alliances. And so our junior allies should always be thinking a little bit about what can they do for themselves. And I think not just Trump too, but that shines a bright light on it. But the preceding 10 years or so really should getting us thinking a bit more about the question of self-reliance. And Gareth, you said as one of your 4 things is, more self-reliance. So in our last 3 or 4 minutes, I was wondering if each of you could give a sort of short, sharp, pithy, what you see Australia could do in a more self-reliant manner to give itself options and flexibility and security in a world that is very, very unstable compared to where we have been.
Well, my little mantra is 4-fold: less America, more self-reliance. And by that, I mean not just in a military sense and more echidna-like sort of capability and less, but genuinely more attention paid to developing our own domestic sources of strength rather than relying to the extent that we have. The third element relates to that. It's more Asia. And by more Asia, I mean far more attention, which Penny Wong, give her credit, has been giving to building direct relationships with our individual Southeast Asian neighbours of real consequence, Indonesia in particular among them, Vietnam, India, Japan, ROK. These are critical relationships, and developing closer military and political engagement and being very, very active in supporting regional economic integration through all these other alphabet soup mechanisms, RCEP and others. These are critical dimensions of giving us capability to survive in a difficult environment with less reliance on the United States. And the final one is more global engagement, because I don't think in any of this we can ignore the contribution that we can make to a global set of institutions which have served the world remarkably well over the decades since World War II and are at risk on a greater scale than they ever have been. And I think combination of middle powers working together with a bit of energy and commitment and stamina and creativity can make a bit of a difference as a counterweight to the other forces that are in play. So all of these things are sort of integrated. It's not just defence self-reliance, it's a matter of standing on our own feet and rethinking the priorities in our relationships elsewhere.
Yeah.
Look, I agree. I agree with pretty much everything that Gareth has said. I think that we should be thinking about more self-reliance, not because of the alliance, as I said before. I think it's as reliable as it's ever been, but I think that Australia has divorced a lot of its responsibility in the region and its responsibility for protecting itself to another country, which we should never have done. I think that it should be supported by relationships, absolutely. I think it should be supported by bolstering defence. I do not believe that the echidna strategy or territorial defence would protect our maritime domain, but we won't get into that because we don't have all night. So I think focusing on those areas is incredibly important. But I think number one is really understanding what are our vital interests? What are the things that matter to Australia, and how do we intend to protect them? What do we think we need to be able to do on our own, and what do we think we need to be able to do with the US? And I'm not sure that we really clearly understand that at the moment.
And Hugh, final word to you.
Thanks, Nick. Look, I think there are two parts to this. The first is we do need to start building the relationships we're going to need in an Asia which is no longer dominated and made safe for us by the United States. And exactly as Gareth says, that means a different kind of approach, the kind of relationships we have with the substantial powers in our region and the rest. There's one in particular we ought to mention, and that is Indonesia. Well before the AUKUS submarines are delivered, Indonesia will have the fourth biggest economy in the world. It's going to be a great power next door. And thinking about that is really critical. The second thing is we need to build a defence force which can defend Australia independently from the forces that a major Asian power could deploy into our neighbourhood. This is a very different way of conceiving our primary defence task than any we've had in the past. It's the only way I think that fits the strategic future we face in the decades ahead. It's a huge challenge, but I think it can be done. But it needs a very different kind of defence policy and a very different kind of defence organisation from the one we have today.
Well, that, I'm afraid, is all we have time for. As each of our speakers has intimated, this is a vast topic, and it's something I think all of us will be revisiting possibly on a daily basis in different dimensions. But I think Jen's advice is probably the best, which is look at these things coolly, rationally, and in proportion. I think the Trump MO in particular is one of a lot of noise. We must do everything we can to not be distracted by that, notwithstanding the reality that this is a pretty unusual administration. Before we go, I would like to express my thanks to a number of people who've made this evening possible. First of all, to the audience for taking the time to join us this evening. We're extremely grateful for that. I'd like to thank Tori Dillon and the team and University Events here at La Trobe, who do a spectacular job behind the scene in bringing an event as big and complex as this together. And probably above all, Hugh White referred to my colleague Rob Mann and his baton, which implies he's a field marshal, which is probably underestimating his stature in certainly at La Trobe and in Australia's intellectual firmament. The Ideas and Societies program is a real jewel in La Trobe's crown, and it's a thrill to be part of it. Thanks, Rob, for your leadership on this. It's always fantastic to be part of these conversations. Go well, thank you, and good night.